If you're just tuning in now online, or if you snuck in after the Chapel News, my name is Chase. I serve as the lead pastor here in Nordonia, and I'm just glad to be here with you all this morning. So I'm going to read from Esther chapter 1, not the whole thing, but a decent-sized chunk of it, and then we will pray, and then we'll hopefully work our way through all of Esther 1 this morning. So Esther chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Now in the days of Xerxes, the Xerxes who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Xerxes sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all his staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbna, Bigtha, Abigatha, Zethar, and Carcass, those are all names we're considering for our child, the 7 eunuchs who were served in the presence of King Xerxes, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And at this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Lord, thank you that, again, we can read this story that took place so long ago, and our lives can be transformed today. Lord, I pray now that you will speak through me, that any word that's not from you would just simply be forgotten. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, if you've spent pretty much any time on the internet, on social media specifically, over the last decade or so, chances are you've probably seen or maybe heard of this guy right here. I don't know how many of you guys recognize that picture right there. If you've never seen this or you have no idea what this is from an internet video, a YouTube video in the early 2000s of a guy named Super Hot Fire. Okay, now you've probably seen like maybe some GIFs or something about him possibly, but he was the star of what was known as the rap battle parody video series. Now for those of you who don't know, a rap battle is pretty much when people use rap or rhyme to try and boast about themselves or diss other people. I heard someone say once that a rap battle is pretty much like aggressive poetry, and that like an aggressive poetry contest, and that kind of stuck with me. But anyway, so this guy in the early 2000s, he put out a series of videos where they were a parody of rap battles. And so he and his friends would be rapping back and forth at each other, and there was always one guy who was really good, and then there was Super Hot Fire who was terrible, but everyone in the crowd would be jumping around and hyping him up, and it was just hilarious. If you've never seen it, they got 62 million views, which was a lot at that time. I mean, that's a lot anytime, but 62 million views, and so he was really famous off of this video series. Now, if you've recognized this picture, what you might not know is that this guy's name is Deshaun Raw. Okay, Deshaun Raw. I think there's another picture. This is Deshaun Raw. He's not a rapper. And the reason why you've probably heard this or never heard the name Deshaun Raw, even if you recognize those other pictures, is because Deshaun Raw, when he was at the height of his fame, he decided that he didn't need YouTube, right? He didn't need all that, and he was better than that. And so one day in this incoherent rant, he posted this video where he was saying, hey, I'm the funniest guy in the world. I don't need all these videos. And he deleted his whole YouTube channel. Now he had a lot of money coming in. He was famous. And in an attempt to show that he was more famous than he thought he was, he just made this big mistake of deleting his channel. I was curious as to what he's up to now. And he's trying to be a stand-up comedian, but it's just not really working out too well. And he's not even close to the level of fame that he was at when he was putting out those videos. Well, here in this first chapter of Esther, we see a similar story play out on a much larger scale with this man who's literally the king of the world, and he thinks that he has more power than he actually has, and he makes a crucial mistake that just results in embarrassment and kind of brings him down a couple levels in humility. And so what I want to do this morning as we work our way through this first chapter of Esther is I want us to remember that the book of Esther and this first chapter, it's not really just about the royal figures that are in the book, right? It's not about King Xerxes, or it's not really about Esther or Queen Vashti or Haman and Mordecai when we get there. No, the whole story of the book of Esther is about God. We said last week that Esther is not the main character of the story, right? She's not even mentioned until Esther chapter 2, but King Xerxes isn't the main character either, neither is Queen Vashti or anyone else, but this is something that we should read, seeing what the Lord wants us to know about himself, and ultimately what we can learn about ourselves from that as well. Right? Because the book of Hebrews tells us that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and so that means the God of 5th century BC is still the same God of 21st century AD, and so we can learn a lot about him in this book. So without repeating all the historical background of the book of Esther, we went through that last week. Some of you are like, thank God we don't have to go through that again. But let me remind us, the book of Esther is set during the reign of King Xerxes. Now I said last week, if you know the movie 300, this is the same Xerxes from the movie 300. His Persian name was Khashaharaah, and his Hebrew name was Ahasuerus, which if you use the English Standard Version of the Bible, it uses his Hebrew name. But like I said last week, I'm substituting the name Xerxes whenever it says that. One, just because it's so much easier to say, and two, just so that we remember who it is that we're talking about, since Xerxes is a famous figure in history. And like we read earlier and talked about last week, the story starts with King Xerxes throwing himself this big party. And if you remember, we said that this party that he threw was really a military strategizing meeting because he was trying to figure out how he could beat his rivals, the Greeks. They were going back and forth, and the Greeks and the Persians had some of the most legendary battles all throughout history. And so he decides to have this big meeting that turns into a party for 180 days. If you were online at all this past week, I'm sure you saw pictures from the Met Gala, which is where celebrities dressed up and went to a party and did whatever, I guess, rich people do at parties where you dress up. And the tickets cost upwards of $30,000 is what I'm told. And so that just seems insane, but that's nothing compared to the party that's going on here. Because this party that Xerxes threw lasted for 6 months. And it doesn't stop there after 6 months, because look what happens next. He throws a party for his staff as well. It's like the after party, if you will. Look at verse 5. It says, and when these days were completed, so after the 180-day party was over, then the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Okay, so Xerxes says, okay, 180 days wasn't enough. I'm going to throw an after party. This time it's not just for all the military leaders, but this is for all the servants. Everyone from the bottom to the top is welcome to this party. And he says in verse 8 that everyone's getting drunk, right? There's no limit to how much people can drink. Moderation is non-existent at this party, and it's free refills on all the drinks. And the king, on top of this, he's bringing out all of the most expensive items in the kingdom. We're not going to read through the list of what's there again, but a lot of the list of the gold and all of that in verses 6 and 7 there's actually no Hebrew word for that. And so it's just to show us how rich the king is and how magnificent the king is. One commentator says this: the description in verses 6 through 7, talking about all the riches at the party, the description is meant to be jaw-dropping in its sense of wonder. There's nothing in Old Testament literature to rival it except for the tabernacle and later the temple of Solomon. So as we read this, we're supposed to be just in awe of how rich this king is. Kind of reminds me of another king who threw a party, right? If you were with us during the Daniel series, in Daniel chapter 5, King Belshazzar throws a party, and he has them go get all the riches from the basement. And if you know the story, you know that God shows up by a hand on the wall and starts writing out this prophecy. And the king's mom doesn't know what to do, and so she calls on the prophet Daniel, who comes up and says, hey, that writing pretty much means that the Babylonian Empire, it's over. And that very night, the Persian Empire came over and took over the Babylonians. And so at this party, God doesn't show up explicitly, but his hand is about to move in this party as well, because look at what happens in verse 10. Verse 10, it says, on the seventh day, okay, so the party should be winding down. It's not, because look at what it says next. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, okay, so he's drunk. And what does he do? Well, he commanded, this whole list of names I'm not going to go through again, but he commands these 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Xerxes to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. Some translations and some scholars believe that she was called forth only to be wearing her crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So what's going on? Well, he's drunk, and he's drunkenly calling his wife, the queen, out to parade her in front of his guests. Okay, now pause right here in the story. This is where we come to the mistake that Xerxes makes that shows that he's not in as much control as he thought he is. Okay, he's about to make a mistake and dig a hole for himself in a huge way here. And this brings us to the first point this morning. This isn't the main point of the story, but this is an important point, and that's that humility is critical to godly living. Okay, humility is critical to godly living. Again, this isn't the main point of the story of Esther. Okay, and this is not the main point of Esther chapter 1, but it's an important point that we just can't just speed past, because King Xerxes was not humble, and he's about to suffer the consequences. And we need to read this story and recognize that we do need to be humble, because if we're not humble, then God can and he will humble us. Why is humility important? Well, it's important because it removes any idea in our mind that we are the ones who are sovereign. Right? Sometimes we think that we're sovereign, that we're the ones who are in control, and we might not be, throwing 6-month-long just drunken fest to try and show our sovereignty, but it shows in us when things go the right way in our lives and things seem to be going good, and we think that we're in those circumstances because of our own works and our own efforts. But no, we fail to often realize that it's only because of God's mercy and his grace. One of the ways this is seen, and I'm preaching to myself right here, one of the ways that this is seen is in our failure at times to pray. Because why are we supposed to pray? Well, we pray, one, because we're asking the Lord to move in certain ways in our lives and to help us out in certain areas, but most importantly, we pray because it's a constant reminder to us that we're not in control, right? That we need God. Prayer is a reminder of God's sovereignty, and a lack of prayer is really a lack of humility. Because then we think we have it all together. We think we're the ones in control. And so prayer should force us to recognize God's sovereignty. It takes humility to pray. It also takes humility to realize that we need Jesus. Right? To realize that Jesus and Jesus alone is the living hope that we sang about at the beginning of the service. To quote Tim Keller, I've used this quote before, but I think it's a great quote. He says this. Tim Keller is a pastor in New York. He says, the Christian gospel is that I'm so flawed that Jesus had to die for me. Yet I'm so loved and valued that Jesus was glad to die for me. This leads to a deep humility and a deep confidence at the same time. I cannot feel superior to anyone, and yet I have nothing to prove to anyone. I do not think more of myself nor less of myself. Instead, I think of myself less. Okay, so what's this showing? It's showing us that a right understanding of the gospel should lead us to have hearts of humility. And humility is critical to godly living. Again, this isn't the main point of Esther chapter 1. It's not the main point of the book of Esther, but it's something we can't just pass by. Because Xerxes is about to learn that, like the book of Proverbs says, pride goes before destruction and haughtiness goes before the fall. And Xerxes is about to be humbled here in the next couple verses. Because look at what happens after he drunkenly calls on his wife, to look at verse 11 one more time, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuch. So he calls her out to parade her in front of his friends and military leaders. And what does she do? She says no. Now, we read this earlier. And if you read the book of Esther through the week, or if you've read the book of Esther before, you knew this was coming, right? That this shouldn't have come as a surprise. But in light of what we know of how powerful Xerxes is, right? He's in control of 127 provinces. He has all of this wealth that he's been flexing for 180 days. In light of the fact of how powerful Xerxes is, when we come to this fact that Queen Vashti said no when he called on her, like that should cause us to gasp. Right? We should say, what in the world? This is the king of the world. How can you say no to the king of the world? And in a way, it's sort of ironic. Because, again, he's been flexing his wealth for 180 days, trying to show how in control he is, trying to get people to join his side. And now there's a rebellion, not from the Greeks and not from within his own empire, but from within his own family. Growing up, I think one of the most awkward moments when you're a kid is when you're over at your friend's house and your friend starts getting in trouble by their parents. You know that situation, and you might be in the basement and your friend gets called upstairs, and then you might hear some yelling, and he comes back with like his lip quivering and eyes red. I've been on both sides of those when I was growing up. And you're just sitting there, and it's just awkward. Well, I think the most awkward situation that we can possibly imagine pales in comparison to this right here. Okay, because this king, again, he's the king of the known world, and now he's not just embarrassed, but we're told that he's angry. And again, the whole point of this 6-month-long party that he's thrown is to show how in control he is and how rich and how powerful he is. And now he's humiliated and he's enraged, and we're told that he burns with anger. And look what happens in verse 16. The king ends up calling together his group of advisors, which is also kind of ironic because he's been trying to show how in control he is of the world, but he can't even figure out what to do here, so he has to call his inner circle. They hold an emergency meeting, and look what happens in verse 16. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and all the officials, "Not only against the king has Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, 'King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she didn't come.' This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same thing to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty." Okay, so what's he doing? He's saying, oh no, okay, we have a problem here, king, and we need to figure out what we're going to do to cover this up, or else the problem's going to just multiply, and pretty soon we're not going to be able to control anything. And as a side note, isn't this kind of how the enemy works in our lives? Right? Like, we can fall into one pitfall of thinking that we don't take sin serious enough, right? That's one danger that we can fall into. But on the other hand, we can try and come up with all kinds of ways to try and cover up something, and then it just makes the situation completely worse, right? We know the Bible story of David and Bathsheba, right? And David committed adultery and then tried to cover it up, and that led to murder and ultimately the death of his son. To use a more modern example, I mentioned last week that I'm a huge fan of the musical Hamilton. If you've seen that or listened to that, this isn't a spoiler because you hopefully learned about this in U.S. history, but Alexander Hamilton, he also had an affair, and he tried to cover it up by writing about it and sharing it to everybody. Like, he thought that was going to be a good idea, and it ended up just making the situation completely worse. It basically ended his political career. And so this Memucan character, in the same way, he says, hey, people are going to find out about this. And so look at what he does. Look at verse 19. He says, "If it pleased the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Okay, so you see what he's doing? This is kind of funny. He's saying, oh, people are going to find out about this, so we better write a law in every language in 127 provinces and tell people about it so that they don't do that. Okay, so he's exposing himself through this law and letting everybody know what happened. When if he just didn't do anything, then maybe no one would know. But then also, it's kind of funny too, because what did Queen Vashti not want to do? She didn't want to come before the king. So he says, let's make a law that Queen Vashti never has to come before the king. So that's kind of interesting as well. But depending on which extra biblical source you use, both the identity of Vashti as well as her reason for not wanting to come before the king can differ. Some scholars think that she had leprosy or some kind of physical illness and that she was concerned with her outward beauty. And so scholars really focus on her as being disobedient in the story, as if the role of Queen Vashti is somehow to contrast with Esther, and Vashti's the disobedient one, and Esther's the obedient wife, and that's ridiculous. I didn't mean to let my bias show right there, but it is. Other Hebrew scholars believe that Vashti was actually the youngest daughter of King Belshazzar. Okay, in Daniel chapter 5 again, the king that throws this party. He throws this party, and he had a really young daughter at the time. And so people believe the Persians came in and carried off his young daughter. And so now this is 50 years later. And so she's the queen. She's in her 50s. And so many people say that this wasn't just more of a rebellion built out of her own autonomy or desire for autonomy, but that it was built out of her ethnic identity. And she said, no, I'm first and foremost a Babylonian woman. I'm not going to just come whenever you want me to come in front of your friends. No, I'm a Babylonian woman. And so people say that her denial was less about her own autonomy and more about her ethnic identity. And then modern scholars focus primarily on the fact that her decision was rooted in her refusal to bow to patriarchal systems of her day, and that she refused to allow herself to be turned into a visual object, and so she said no. But here's the deal. We're not told why Vashti said no. Okay, all we're told is that she said no. And if it was critical for us to understand the story to know why she said no, then we would be told why she said no, but all we're told is that she said no. I want to read a quote from a commentator named Karen Jobes. She's a well-known professor at Wheaton College. And sometimes when you read commentaries, a lot of the quotes are very lengthy, and I try and condense them most of the time, but I think it's important to read this whole quote. So this is fairly lengthy, but I think it's important. But this is what Karen Jobes says on the matter. We are not told why Vashti said no. We want to cheer her as she stands up to these men behaving very badly, and we are quick to applaud her courage and dignity. Before we do, we need to ask what signals the storyteller gives us. The answer is none. He, the storyteller, is not interested in encouraging us to boo or cheer Vashti. We may be wrong in assuming that Vashti is standing up for the dignity of women. She too may have been drunk and just decided to get back at Xerxes after some tiff. We have no idea. In Jewish and Christian history, commentators have sometimes booed her for not submitting to her husband and sometimes cheered her for standing up for the dignity of women. We need to be clear. The point is that our evaluation of Vashti's actions tells more about us than about the narrative, which is silent about her motives, telling us nothing as to their virtue or error. Vashti says no, and this is all that matters to the storyteller. Okay, so we can read this story using our modern lenses and trying to think of how this speaks directly into our culture today, and when we do that, we'll end up in some crazy places. Yeah, I've over the past week been reading some well-known theologians and well-respected Bible scholars throughout church history, and the things that they said about Queen Vashti were just awful. It almost makes you sick to your stomach as they're trying to paint her as the villain or as a lesson for wives to just blindly obey their husbands regardless of what they want. Not mutually submit like the New Testament talks about, but for wives just to blindly obey their husband, which is a wicked, evil manipulation of the text here in Esther chapter 1. On the other hand, Some people take this story, again, as a model of the modern day feminist movement. I came across this book this week as I was preparing this message, Queen Vashti's Comfy Pants. And so I'll read the description here. It says, why did Queen Vashti, the Purim royal, refuse to obey her king's demand? Although the traditional biblical text gives us no real clue, that should be a hard stop right there, this story humorously imagines what it might have been like for a queen to stand up for herself against a string of high-handed demands. And so what I'm getting at is, if we're going to read this through with a modern lens and try and get it to speak specifically into our circumstances, we can end up in some crazy places. This is not the point of Esther chapter 1. However, because of so many of the horrific and misogynistic misrepresentations of this passage in the past, I can't go past this without pointing to our second point. Again, this is not the main point of the text, but this is an important point, and that's that women are indispensable parts of God's redemptive plan. Yeah, I was thinking I was going to get some amens right there, but women are indispensable parts of God's redemptive plan. So hopefully this is obvious and clear to all of us, but we can't just speed past this, because just like the Bible's been used in the past to justify abuse or racism or even slavery, it's no secret that this has also been a favorite of many individuals with male chauvinistic ideologies to promote their selfish desires. And one of the ways that this has been done is by degrading and villainizing certain women in the Bible, especially in instances where we're not told explicitly if they're a moral role model to follow after or not. For example, to use David and Bathsheba again. And I don't know how many times I've heard the story of David and Bathsheba taught, where Bathsheba comes out as the villain in the story. Right, as if she's like Potiphar's wife in the book of Genesis trying to seduce David. But no, David is the bad guy in the story. Right, he's supposed to be at war fighting. And yet the text gets twisted so much to paint Bathsheba to be the bad villain in the story, and the same is done here with Queen Vashti. She's often made out to be the villain. Let me read one more semi-lengthy quote. This is from a book written by one of my former professors, Dr. Sandra Glahn. She wrote a book called Vindicating the VIXENS. And in this book, she looks at several women in the Bible like Bathsheba and Vashti and Sarah and Mary Magdalene and these women in the Bible who are often painted in lights that assume them to be the villain. But here's what she says about Vashti. She says, Vashti's removal, stripping of title, and disappearance was not a commentary on the importance of female submission. Okay, she's combating against what all of these other theologians have been saying, that this is a lesson on why wives just need to blindly obey their husbands. She's saying, no, that's not the case. But rather, this is a forewarning of what would become of the Jewish people without divine intervention. Vashti's presence is vital in the narrative because with her we see the impossible odds that Esther faces. If Vashti, a woman of noble blood and ancestry, a rightful queen, can be disposed for her good sense, then Esther, the convert, Jew, outsider, and potential orphan, doesn't stand a chance in the Persian court. Okay, what she's saying is that when we read the story of Vashti, we're supposed to realize, okay, even a queen who was born of noble birth, she can get kicked out of the palace, and who knows what happened to her. Well, then when Esther is faced with the decision where her life is on the line, it's supposed to seem completely and totally helpless. That's the reason why Vashti's story is in the Bible. Not so that we can try and paint some right or wrong and paint her as the hero or the villain. Yet even if the lesson and main takeaway from this story isn't just simply about female empowerment, it's so important and crucial for us to recognize that these key women, Esther and Vashti, are crucial to the redemptive plan that's unfolding in the story. And it's not just in this story here, but it's also seen all throughout Scripture. Right? That women are in places that make them crucial to God's redemptive plan. And this is one of the reasons why we can trust the Bible as a historically accurate document. Right? Because if a story about a young orphan rising up in the Persian Empire and saving her people, like if that story can be preserved throughout all the years, well, it's not because it was received well by people at the time, but because it's true. And it's remarkable, all the instances where women are overlooked and often seen as dispensable characters in biblical times, where they're actually key figures throughout the Bible. And while we here at the chapel hold unashamedly to what's called a complementarian view, that we believe there's differences between men and women, but we're equal in value, if we as a church claim to be complementarian without lifting up and recognizing and celebrating the essential role that women play in God's redemptive story, then we might not be holding on as tightly to biblical values as we claim. But while this isn't the main point, God works in and through women in this book to bring about the saving of his people. To quote from Dr. Glon's book one more time, again, this time she's talking about Esther. She says, "In this sex-saturated world, knowing that God instead honors a woman's character is frankly liberating. God chooses the unlikely and the unwanted. He scans the fringes and sees invisible people." God chooses the unlikely and the unwanted. And remember, God's name is not even mentioned in this whole book. And he does this without making it known front and center that he's the one doing it, which leads to the main point of the book of Esther and the main point of Esther chapter 1. We can pull all kinds of lessons about humility and pride out of this. We can talk about what this means for female empowerment, but here's the deal. This is the point of Esther chapter 1. God will use the pride of Xerxes and the refusal of Vashti to redeem his people. It's as simple as that. That's the main point of this first chapter, and this all ties back to the theme of the book, that even when it seems like God is silent, he's working to accomplish his purposes. Because listen, God is working all throughout the book, not just through the obedience of his people, but through the blatant disregard of God from the Persians. And whether Vashti's actions are morally praiseworthy or not, God uses her actions to bring about what he wants to happen. This is what we're reminded about over and over again through this book. And this is good news for us, right? Because our societal landscape looks a lot like 5th century Persia and people's relationship with God. Okay, we might not have to put up with the same levels of the depths of depravity that's seen by the king here in Esther, but if not all, many of our political leaders in our day live and legislate with blatant disregard to God, right? And men, women, and children in our day live in a constant pursuit of pleasure like the men who were at Xerxes' party. And here we are as people claiming to be followers of Jesus, left trying to figure out how we're going to navigate this world in light of what Jesus did for us on the cross. But this is what we need to realize, and this is what Esther tells us over and over again, and that's that we don't need to figure out what to do in life because of what Jesus has already done. Okay, we don't have to figure out what to do because of what Jesus has already done. You say, where do I see that in the book of Esther? God's not even mentioned, let alone Jesus being mentioned. Well, catch this. We're led to think in these opening verses in Esther chapter 1 that King Xerxes is all powerful, right? He has over 100 provinces that he's ruling. He can throw a 6-month drunken fest without his pockets hurting at all. And yet we realize when we read the story that God is basically using him like a puppet. Right? That God works behind the scenes, that the unseen God sees everything and he's bringing about his purposes, and he can even use the wickedness of the Persians to do that. And we live on the opposite side of Jesus' coming to earth and his death and his burial and his resurrection. And when we think about that, we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, but the whole reason the Jewish people were preserved was so that Jesus could come into the world. And now, in light of the finished work of the cross, we don't have to live in despair when we look out into the chaos of our world today, when we see prideful rulers, or when we're treated unfairly at work or at school, or when we look at the racial dynamics of our world and we don't even know where to begin and what's right and what's wrong, and it's all so twisted and convoluted, or we see our loved ones and our families that are suffering and hurting and sick and some dying, and we're left just asking and just calling out, God, where are you in the midst of this? What are we supposed to do? How can we live as Christians in this world where we just don't know what to do? Well, the book of Esther reminds us that when we feel unseen or uncared for, we can rest in the grace of God, knowing that he is the God who sees and that he does care for us. And even when we can't see him, he's working behind the scenes to accomplish his purposes. And we know that because of what he's done in Esther's time and because of what he's continuing to do for us today, because we are his children. Let me close with this. Most of you know probably that Amanda and I are expecting our second child pretty much any second now. Right, and we've been trying to finish out house projects around the house, and so thankful for some of you who have been coming over to help us with some of those projects. And we got the car seat installed, and those of you who've been through this process know that it's exciting, but it's also stressful. Right, it's also stressful because there's so much to do, and this can happen at any time. I've got to have my phone on me at all times. I actually don't know where it is right now, but it's okay because I have visual eye contact here, so I know that we're good. But we've got a bag in our room packed, just ready to just be able to leave at any moment's notice. And parenting is the same way, right? It's exciting, but it's also stressful. There's difficult moments that shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us, but hopefully as our children grow, they realize our love for them and the bonds of parents and children, we hope, continue to grow as they get older. Doesn't always happen that way, but that's how it should. Well, I'm a long way away, Lord willing, from this next stage, and that's being a grandparent. Now, many of you in the room are grandparents. I'm just going to say, from my side, did you point at Will? Okay, anyway. Now, I'm saying this from this side of things, being a parent, not being a grandparent yet. I'm just going to be real. It seems like grandparents get the good side of the deal, right? Okay, good. The grandparents are agreeing with me. I'm glad. Right? And grandparents are essential and necessary and loved, but at the end of the day, right, if the baby's crying, if you want to, you can easily hand the baby back to the parents. Right? If the baby is just acting out of control, you can say, hey, come get your kid. Your kid is acting up. Well, the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's an old church saying. I just came across this week. Many of you may have heard this saying before, but I heard it for the first time, and it just immediately sunk in, and here's what it is. God has no grandchildren. Okay, God has no grandchildren. What does that mean? Well, it means that God has a personal relationship with each and every one of us if we're his followers. It means that we're sons and daughters of God, not because of our parents' faith, not because of our grandparents' faith, but because we've made a personal decision in our lives to submit to God as the Lord of our lives. Okay, God has no grandchildren. His relationship with us is personal. And so that means when we go through difficult times in our lives, God's not going to just hand us off to someone else and say, hey, you can help this person, right? He's with us in the moment, caring for us and consoling us. And listen to me, whether or not we feel his presence in the moment, God is with us. And we don't have to live with a sense of fear that we're going to do something so big that God won't continue to love us anymore. Right? We cannot out-sin God's grace. We can't, like the guy with the YouTube channel, make a mistake that we're going to regret for the rest of our life, or like the king, get in some circumstance or situation that we can't get ourselves out of. No, God, he won't stop loving us, and we can have confidence in that because when we put our faith in him, we're eternally secure. And when we know and focus on the fact that we are eternally secure, not because of anything that we've done, not because of anything that we can do, but because of what Jesus did, then we can know that we can trust God in the good, we can trust God in the bad, and we can trust God in the unknown because he was faithful in Esther's time, and he's faithful now. Well, we haven't even met Esther in the story yet, but Lord willing, we'll get to that next week.
This has been a message from the Chapel. Thanks for joining us today. For more information about the Chapel or any of our campuses, including Akron, Greene, Wadsworth, Kenmore, Cuyahoga Falls, and Nordonia, please go to our website at thechapel.life.